Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest Andariel's Barrage Rogue build in Season 5. With this build you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards and destroy Uber Lilith. This build does tons of damage and can quickly stagger any bosses in seconds. And I highly recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you clearing a tier 8 Infernal Horde solo. I can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes and get tons of materials. This build is so strong that it can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and quickly shred bosses. This build also has a lot of crowd control and can stagger bosses in seconds. Now the main source of damage for this build is poison damage, and you'll need to fully masterwork your gear in order to easily clear the highest level content in the game. Now there are two key items for this build. The first is the Andariel's Visage Uber unique helmet, because it'll allow you to do tons of poison damage. And the second key item is a unique weapon, the Umbra Crux. With the Umbra Crux, you'll create a shade totem when you use a subterfuge skill. And with the shade totem, you can easily destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. And with this unique weapon, you can basically have infinite energy, because this unique weapon will give you plus ranks to innervation, which will allow you to quickly regain mana when you lucky hit. But you also need the uber unique ring, the Ring of Starless Skies, to reduce the resource cost of your skills. But if you don't have the Ring of Starless Skies uber unique ring, then you can use a legendary aspect, the Starlight aspect, paired with the Andariel's Visage to quickly regain mana. And this build does require a lot of lucky hit chance for this build to work. Now I'm going to show you a build with uber uniques, but you don't need multiple uber uniques to do the hardest content in the game. What's more important than uber uniques is masterworking your gear to greatly increase your damage and survivability. Now I'm going to showcase a build so you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes, but in the D4 build planner linked in the description below, I'll share two builds, one with multiple uber uniques and a build with just the uber unique helmet and Andariel's Visage if you can't find the other uber uniques. But I'll cover everything in more details in their dedicated sections. So next for the skills. Now the core skill for this build is Barrage, and this skill will unleash a barrage of arrows that damages enemies. Barrage will also ricochet off enemies and can apply vulnerable to them. Now the majority of the damage is coming from the poison imbuement skill applied to Barrage, which will allow Barrage to deal poison damage rather than from the skill itself. The next skill I'm using is Caltrops, and this skill will make you leap backwards and throw Caltrops on the ground that deals damage and chills enemies. Enemies that are in the Caltrop will take increased damage from you. Now since this skill chills enemies, this skill will greatly pair with our other skills and a legendary aspect, the aspect of Noxious Ice, to easily freeze enemies and greatly increase your poison damage. And also leaping backwards is really good to dodge enemies' attacks and gaining some distance, making this skill really good for survivability. The next skill I'm using is Poison Imbuement, and this skill will imbue your weapon with poison, allowing your skills to do poison damage. And doing poison damage will be our main source of damage, and since this build has a lot of lucky hit chance, you can reduce this skill's cooldown, allowing you to always have the poison imbuement skill active all the time. The next skill I'm using is Poison Trap, and this skill will place a trap on the ground that applies poison damage to enemies. Poison Trap will also increase your poison damage and knock down enemies. Now we are going to pair this skill with the unique weapon, the Umbra Crux, to create a shade totem to easily destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. And the next skill I'm using is the ultimate skill, Death Trap, and this skill will place a trap on the ground that pulls enemies and deals tons of damage. And because of our specialization, Preparation, Death Trap will also reset the cooldown of our other skills. And the last skill I'm using is Shadow Step. And this skill will quickly move you to an enemy, stunning and damaging them and making you unstoppable. And since Shadow Step is a cutthroat skill, this skill will greatly increase your damage because of our key passive, Close Quarters Combat. Now in the highest tier pits, you do want to mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects and on bosses to quickly stagger them and greatly increase your damage. Okay, so next for the specialization. Now I'm using the Preparation specialization, and this states spend 75 energy to reduce your ultimate skills cooldown by 5 seconds. Ultimate skills reset other cooldowns and grant 15% damage reduction for 10 seconds. So this specialization will greatly reduce your ultimate skills cooldown when you spend energy. And using your ultimate skill, you will reset all your other skills cooldown and greatly increase your damage reduction. Okay, so next for the skill tree. Now I'm going to showcase a build so you can easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hordes, and I'll have the full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the basic skills, I put 2 points into Puncture, and we are not actually using this skill, but we need 2 skill points in the basic skill to unlock the next skill path. Next for the core skills, I put 1 point into Barrage, a point into Enhanced Barrage, and a point into Improved Barrage. And this skill will unleash a barrage of arrows that damages enemies. Barrage will also ricochet off enemies and can apply vulnerable to them. Now the majority of the damage is coming from the poison imbuement skill applied to Barrage, which deals poison damage rather than from the skill itself. So we only need to put 1 point into Barrage, and then I put 3 points into Sturdy, and this skill will greatly increase your damage reduction to close enemies, making this skill really good for survivability. Next, for the agility skills, I put 1 point into Shadow Step, a point into Enhanced Shadow Step, and a point into Disciplined Shadow Step. And this skill will quickly move you to an enemy, stunning and damaging them and making you unstoppable. And since Shadow Step is a cutthroat skill, this skill will greatly increase your damage because of the key passive close quarters combat. Now in the highest tier pits, you do want to mainly use this skill to break out of crowd control effects, and on bosses to quickly stagger them and greatly increase your damage. Next, I put 1 point into Caltrops, a point into Enhanced Caltrops, and a point into Methodical Caltrops. And this skill will make you leap backwards and throw Caltrops on the ground that deals damage and chills enemies. Enemies that are in the Caltrops will take increased damage from you. Now since this skill chills enemies, this skill will greatly pair with our other skill in a legendary aspect, the aspect of Noxious Ice, to easily freeze enemies and to greatly increase your poison damage. Next, I put 3 points into Unstable Elixirs, and with this skill, when you use a potion, it will stun surrounding enemies and greatly increase your damage. And this skill will allow you to use your potions even when you have full life. So with this skill, you want to use your potions often to crowd control enemies and to greatly increase your damage. Next, for the subterfuge skills, I put 1 point into Poison Trap, a point into Enhanced Poison Trap, and a point into Subverting Poison Trap. And this skill will place a trap on the ground that applies poison damage to enemies. Poison Trap will also increase your poison damage and knock down enemies. Now we are going to pair this skill with a unique weapon, the Umbra Crux, to create a Shade Totem to easily destroy groups of enemies and melt bosses. Next, I put 5 points into Dark Shroud, a point into Enhanced Dark Shroud, and a point into Countering Dark Shroud. Now this skill will surround you with balls of shadow that will grant you damage reduction per active Dark Shroud. Each active Dark Shroud will also increase your movement speed and critical strike chance. Now even though we're not putting this skill on our skill bar, we can easily activate this skill because of a legendary aspect, the Umbrous aspect, which will give you a chance to grant free Dark Shroud shadows when you critically strike an enemy. And this skill is really good for defense, survivability, and mobility. Next, I put 3 points into Agile, and this skill will greatly increase your dodge chance when you use a cooldown skill, which is really strong for survivability. Next, I put 3 points into Exploit, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to healthy and injured enemies. And next, I put 3 points into Malice, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to vulnerable enemies. Okay, so next for the imbuement skills, I put 1 point into Poison Imbuement, a point into Enhanced Poison Imbuement, and a point into Mixed Poison Imbuement. And this skill will imbue your weapon with poison, allowing your skills to do poison damage. And doing poison damage will be our main source of damage. And since this build has a lot of lucky hit chance, you can reduce this skill's cooldown, allowing you to always have the Poison Imbuement skill active all the time. Next, I put 3 points into Deadly Venom, and this skill will greatly increase your poison damage. And then I put 1 point into Debilitating Toxins, and this skill will increase your damage reduction against poison enemies. And then I put 3 points into Alchemical Advantage, and this skill will greatly increase your attack speed and lucky hit chance when dealing poison damage. Next, I put 3 points into Frigid Finesse, and this skill will greatly increase your damage to chilled or frozen enemies and bosses that are staggered. And since we are using the skill Caltrops and some other gear, we can easily chill enemies. And with the legendary aspect, the aspect of Noxious Ice, we can easily freeze enemies and greatly increase your poison damage. Next, for the ultimate skills, I put 1 point into Death Trap, a point into Prime Death Trap, and a point into Supreme Death Trap. And this skill will place a trap on the ground that pulls enemies and deals tons of damage. And because of our specialization, Preparation, Death Trap will also reset the cooldowns of our other skills. And then I put 1 point into Innervation, but because of the unique weapon, the Umbra Crux, I am gaining an additional 7 points into Innervation. And this skill will regain your energy when you lucky hit. And since this build has a lot of lucky hit chance, this skill will basically give you infinite energy. And then I put 1 point into Alchemist Fortune, and this will increase your non-physical damage lucky hit chance. And then I put 3 points into Second Wind, and this skill will grant you a barrier for every 100 energy you spend, making this skill really good for survivability. And last but not least, for the key passive, I put 1 point into Close Quarters Combat, and this states damaging a close enemy with a marksman or cutthroat skill each grant a 15% attack speed bonus for 8 seconds. While both attack speed bonus are active, your damage dealt is increased by 10% of the total amount of damage versus crowd controlled bonus. Now Barrage will be our marksman skill and Shadow Step will be our cutthroat skill. So using both these skills and this key passive will greatly increase your attack speed and damage. Okay, so that's the full skill tree layout for this build to easily destroy huge groups of enemies and shred bosses while having tons of survivability. And I'll have this full skill tree layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so next for the gear. Now, since this is an end game build, ideally you would want to use Uber uniques with this build. However, I also provided alternate gear options if you don't have access to multiple Uber uniques. It's important to note that you don't need multiple Uber uniques to tackle the hardest content in the game, as masterworking your gear is more crucial for significantly boosting your stats and damage. And I've created two different layouts in the D4 build planner linked in the description below. One with multiple Uber uniques and one with just the Andariel's Visage Uber unique helmet. So starting with the helmet, I'm using the Uber unique helmet, the Andariel's Visage. And this helmet is a key item for this build. This helmet has really good stats with all stats, attack speed, and life on hit. But the main reason we're using this Uber unique helmet is the unique aspect, which states lucky hit, up to a 20% chance to trigger a poison nova that applies 110,280 poison damage over 5 seconds to enemies in the area. And this unique aspect does tons of poison damage that will greatly increase the damage we deal. Okay, so next for the chest piece, I'm using the Andariel's Might Uber unique chest piece. And this chest piece is really strong for survivability. This chest piece gives you movement speed, increases your maximum life, increases your maximum resistance, and gives you tons of damage reduction. And the unique aspect states, while at full life, your skills unleash a divine barrage dealing 4,779 damage. Now the unique aspect is good for clearing trash enemies, but the main reason we are using this chest piece is for the stats for gaining tons of survivability. Next for the gloves, I'm using the unique gloves, the Fist of Fate. And these gloves will give you attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and a chance to apply a random crowd control effect to an enemy. And the unique aspect states, your attacks randomly deal 1% to 300% of their normal damage. Now these gloves are really strong to easily crowd control enemies and stagger bosses. These gloves will also greatly increase your lucky hit chance, which is important for this build. Next for the pants, I have dexterity, maximum life, and armor. And for the tempering stats, I have lucky hit chance to freeze enemies and plus ranks to second wind. And the legendary aspect states, lucky hit, critical strikes have up to a 60% chance to grant a free Dark Shroud Shadow. And this legendary aspect is really important for this build to gain Dark Shrouds without needing the skill Dark Shroud on your skill bar. Next for the boots, I have dexterity, movement speed, and dodge chance. And for the tempering stats, I have movement speed and lucky hit chance to daze enemies. And the legendary aspect states, chilled enemies poisoned by poison imbuement will be further chilled for 20% per second. You deal 35% additional poison damage to frozen enemies. And because of our Caltrop skill and other gear, we can easily chill enemies. And using the poison imbuement skill, we can freeze enemies, allowing us to greatly increase our poison damage to them. Next for the weapons. Now for the two-handed weapon, I'm using a bow over a crossbow. And the reason why is because the bow has a higher attack speed over the crossbow. And for the stats, I have dexterity, maximum life, and damage over time. And for the tempering stats, I have chance for barrage projectiles to cast twice and damage per Dark Shroud Shadow. And for the legendary aspect, it states, you deal 40% increased damage over time to enemies for each different crowd control effect they're affected by. Unstoppable enemies and staggered bosses take 80% increased damage over time from you instead. So this legendary aspect will greatly increase our poison damage to crowd controlled enemies and bosses that are staggered. The next weapon I'm using is a one-handed dagger, because the dagger has the highest attack speed over the other one-handed weapons. And for the stats, I have dexterity, maximum life, and damage over time. And for the tempering stats, I have chance for barrage projectiles to cast twice and damage per Dark Shroud Shadow. And for the legendary aspect, it states, lucky hit, poison immune skills have up to a 15% chance to create a toxic pool that deals 12,498 poisoning damage over 3 seconds to enemies within. While standing in the poison pool, your poison imbuement skill has no cooldown and no charge limit. So this legendary aspect will give you a chance to have your poison imbuement skill active all the time. And the next weapon I'm using is a unique dagger, the Umbra Crux. And this is a really strong unique weapon with dexterity, vulnerable damage, subterfuge cooldown reduction, and plus ranks to innervation. And with this weapon, you want to get as much ranks to innervation to basically have infinite energy. And the unique aspect states, your subterfuge skills create a attackable shade totem for 8 seconds. Any base damage it takes is replicated onto surrounding enemies at 20% effectiveness. This effect is treated as a trap skill. You may only have one shade totem active at a time. So when you use your poison trap skill, you will basically create a shade totem, and with the shade totem, you can easily destroy huge groups of enemies and melt bosses in seconds. Next for the amulet, I have attack speed, lucky hit chance, and plus ranks to frigid finesse. But I do want to mention that there will be better stats to get on your amulet, like plus ranks to alchemical advantage and plus ranks to unstable elixirs. But getting all these stats on the amulet is extremely rare. And for the tempering stats, I have poison trap cooldown reduction and damage per Dark Shroud Shadow. In the legendary aspect states, barrage arrows now pierce through one enemy. Barrage has a 37.5% increased attack speed. So this legendary aspect will allow our barrage skill to pierce enemies and greatly increase our barrage skill's attack speed. Next for for the rings. Now for the first ring, I have dexterity, critical strike chance, and damage over time. And for the tempering stats, I have poison imbue, lasts for +3 cast, and damage per dark shroud shadow. And the tempering stats, poison imbue, lasts for +3 cast, is important for this build. You always have your poison imbuement skill active all the time. And the legendary aspect states, increase the damage of arrows that ricochet from barrage from 40% to 80%. Barrage arrows have a 60% chance to split into 2 arrows when they ricochet. So this legendary aspect will greatly increase your barrage damage when they ricochet and have a chance for your arrows to split, allowing you to easily destroy huge groups of enemies. Now for the second ring, I'm using the uber unique ring, the Ring of Starless Skies. And this ring has really good stats, having attack speed, critical strike chance, lucky hit chance, and plus ranks to core skills. And the unique aspect states, spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of your skills and increases your damage by 10% for 3 seconds, up to 50%. So this uber unique ring is really useful to reduce the resource cost of your skills and to greatly increase your damage. And really quickly for the gems, I'm using emerald gems to increase my dexterity stats, and increasing your dexterity will greatly increase your damage. And for the weapon, I'm using diamond gems to greatly increase my ultimate damage, because increasing your ultimate damage will benefit from a legendary node, the No Witness legendary node, which will greatly increase your damage. And for the jewelry, I'm using skull gems to increase my armor. And if you check out my stats, my armor is at 9,435, which is above the armor cap of 9,230. And if you check out my resistance, all my resistance is capped out. And if you checked out my attack speed is capped out at 100%. And if you checked out my lucky hit chance bonus, my lucky hit chance is at 129.7%. Okay, so I did showcase a build layout with uber uniques to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards. And make sure to masterwork your gear, as it's crucial for significantly boosting your stats and damage. I also created 2 different layouts in the D4 build planner linked in the description below. One with multiple uber uniques and one with just the Andariel Visage uber unique helmet. Okay, so next for the Paragon Board. Now this is a fully optimized Paragon Board at level 100 for this build. And with this Paragon Board, I did maximize my damage and survivability to easily clear tier 8 Infernal Hoards. Now I'm just going to quickly go over the Paragon Board, going over the important nodes and glyphs, but I'll have the full Paragon Board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. So starting with the starter board, I'm using the control glyph. And additional bonus states, you deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or instead 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And this build can easily chill and freeze enemies, so this glyph will greatly increase our damage. The next Paragon Board I took is Cheap Shot, and the glyph I'm using is Tracker. And additional bonus states, poisoning damage effect lasts 40% longer, so this glyph will greatly increase your poisoning damage effect. I also took the legendary node Cheap Shot, which states you deal 5% increased damage for each nearby enemy that is crowd controlled, up to 25%. A nearby staggered boss provides the maximum bonus, and with this build you can easily crowd control enemies and quickly stagger bosses in seconds, so this will greatly increase our damage. You also want to take these rare nodes, Calculated and Oppressed, to greatly increase your damage to crowd control enemies, and this rare node Safeguard to gain damage reduction from elites. Then heading right this way, and the next Paragon Board I took is No Witness, and the glyph I'm using is Fluidity. And additional bonus states, when you cast an agility skill, you deal 10% increased damage and gain 15% increased energy regeneration for 6 seconds. So when using Shadow Step, this glyph will greatly increase our damage and resource regeneration. I also took the legendary node No Witness, which states your ultimate skills gain an additional 10% increased damage from your damage with ultimate bonus, and grant this bonus to all skills for 10 seconds when cast. So this will greatly increase our skills damage when we use our ultimate skill. And make sure you take these rare nodes Caller and Ruin to greatly increase your ultimate skills damage, and this rare node Training to greatly increase your maximum life. Now I did split this Paragon Board into 3 directions, so first heading up this way. The next Paragon Board I took is Exploit Weakness, to use the Exploit Weakness legendary node, which states lucky hit, hitting a vulnerable enemy has up to a 60% chance to increase your damage by 1% for 25 seconds, up to 25%. At 25 stacks, this bonus remains for 6 seconds before expiring, so this will greatly increase your damage when you lucky hit vulnerable enemies. Then heading back to the No Witness Paragon Board and heading right this way. And the next Paragon Board I took is Deadly Ambush, and the glyph I'm using is Bane. And additional bonus states, poisoning damage effects have a 15% chance to deal double the amount of damage over their duration, so this glyph will give you a chance to greatly increase your poison damage. I also took the legendary node Deadly Ambush, which states you deal 23% increased critical strike damage to enemies affected by your trap skill, so this will greatly increase your critical strike damage when enemies are affected by your trap skills. And make sure you take this rare node Spring Loaded to gain cooldown reduction for your trap skills. Then heading back to the No Witness Paragon Board and heading down this way. And the last Paragon Board I took is Eldritch Bounty, and the glyph I'm using is Canny. And additional bonus states, non-physical damage increases all the non non-physical damage an enemy takes from you by 1% up to 10% for 15 seconds. So this glyph will greatly increase your poison damage. I also took the legendary node Eldritch Bounty, which states when you attack with an imbued skill, you gain 3% maximum resistance and 20% increased damage for that imbuement's effect for 9 seconds. So this will greatly increase your poison damage when you use your poison imbuement skill. Okay, so that's a fully optimized Paragon board at level 100 for this build for maximizing your damage and survivability. And you want to get your glyphs to at least level 15 plus to be able to get the additional bonus. And like I mentioned before, I'll have this full Paragon board layout in a D4 build planner in the description below. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest Andariel's Barrage rogue build in Season 5. With this build, you can easily clear Tier 8 Infernal Hoards and melt Uber Lilith. This build does tons of damage and can easily destroy any Uber bosses in seconds. And in the D4 build planner linked in the description below, I'll share 2 different build layouts depending on your situation. One build with multiple Uber uniques and a build with just the Uber unique helmet than Andariel's Visage if you can't find the other Uber uniques. Hope this helps and more Diablo 4 videos to come, so stay tuned. And of course,